Opening credits. Bear Attack. A Bear Shifter Older Woman, Younger Man Romance. By Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Chapter 1. I kept my knees pressed tightly together as I listened to him talk. There was something about his voice, the cadence of it, that sent goosebumps up my arms whenever he spoke, and made other parts of my body hot for his attention. His voice made me think of how many nights I spent alone, when I could instead be with a man who excited me. A man like him. His voice, his mere presence, aroused me, I was embarrassed to admit. After all, I was his instructor, and he was my student. And while he was busy giving a presentation on mythical figures in Chinese history, I hadn't been paying attention to a word he'd said, which was pretty unacceptable. "Sydney, get it together, you're a professional," I told myself. I finally focused on the words actually coming from his mouth as he concluded his presentation, and the class began to applaud. All my students were in their mid-20s, currently in the process of earning their master's degrees, and were from different disciplines, hence their topics were always diverse and interesting. From the part one caught at the end, I realized that Paul's presentation most likely had been the best of them all, and if my mind hadn't been in the gutter, I probably would have enjoyed it. "Paul, thank you very much for such a fine presentation," I said. He smiled at me, in that friendly, open manner of his. It was odd that I felt so attracted to him. He wasn't my type, really. I liked the clean-cut, nerdy academic type who wore blazers and tweed hats. I know it sounded like I dated caricatures of men in academia, but that's what all my boyfriends in my adult years looked like. Paul was the absolute opposite. He had a beard, and even though it was expertly manicured, there was still something about it that made him look outdoorsy, as if he would be more comfortable in the mountains hiking than in a classroom presenting. He also kept his hair just a bit too long for my liking, but I felt myself wanting to reach out and touch his dark brown curly locks whenever he was within distance. And then there was the rest of his body. He was tall, that was for sure, at least 6 feet 5 inches, with broad shoulders and chiseled abs that I had accidentally seen when he was stretching in class one day, and long, strong legs. Unlike most guys, he wasn't just powerfully built at the top. No. Paul's thighs were the size of 2 of mine put together, making me wonder if he ran track when he was younger. I cleared my throat and narrowed my eyes at the class, as if I were thinking of something important, when instead, I was giving myself time to clear my mind of my wayward, filled thoughts. Were there any questions? No one said a word, and I shrugged and said to Paul, "Well then, I guess you can take a seat." I wrapped up class, knowing that everyone was tired, and we could continue the remaining presentations the next day. A few stragglers stayed behind to ask me questions, and I was grateful for their presence given that Paul was still there, leaning against the wall with his legs folded across each other at the ankles, seemingly waiting for me. He held his backpack in one hand, and I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. When the other students were gone, I didn't immediately acknowledge him. Instead, I wasted as much time as possible erasing the whiteboard and packing my things. "Need some help?" Paul said, pushing himself away from the wall and crossing the floor in a few long strides. He was suddenly next to me, and I didn't know how to react. He was so close, I could smell him. His aftershave did something to my senses, and then I wondered if it were actually his aftershave or just his natural scent that I was responding so strongly to. I sighed inwardly. This was going to be a long night, I said to myself. "What did you think of my presentation?" "I thought it was a little boring and dry." "I'm glad the class paid attention." He chuckled a little, and I felt my cheeks grow warm. Even his laugh did funny things to me. I was given a respite from responding when he continued, "I've never been the best presenter." He waited for my reply, as he cut off the overhead projector and the computer connected to the base of the podium. He then shut down the laptop that each student had been using for their presentation, leaving nothing for me to do but talk to him. I bit the inside of my cheek. "Don't be awkward, Sydney. Answer his question." I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant as I slipped my leather laptop bag across my shoulders and secured my tablet in it. I guess I would have liked to hear more information about how mythical creatures reflect certain societal ideologies. So mainly, more of a focus on the cultural significance of the creatures and less on the creatures themselves. If that makes sense, I let my voice trail off, happy to have come up with a lame critique that at least sounded educated. However, truth be told, since I had heard nothing but the last 10 words of his presentation, he could have discussed the man on the moon and I wouldn't have known. He nodded and scratched his chin, and then he turned his dark brown eyes on me. "You're right." I smiled tightly and shifted my weight from foot to foot. "Well, I'll see you next Tuesday." He gave me another smile as he turned to walk away. I could have sworn that smile of his held a hint of amusement as he said, "Yep. Thanks, Dr. Gabardi." He sauntered out of the classroom and I gave a sigh of relief. His presence was wreaking havoc on my nerves. And it wasn't until he left the room and I had stared at his backside, a bad habit of mine, that I felt I was able to breathe again. It was after 9 o'clock at night, and most of the evening classes had already wrapped up. I looked around the campus, appreciating the beauty of the ivy that covered most of the buildings under the moonlight. It was a full moon, and the campus was illuminated. It was Parents' Weekend, and I saw a few older teens accompanied by a proud mom and dad as they toured the campus at night. It was a pretty safe campus, so I wasn't alarmed when I heard a sound emerge from near me. I looked in the direction of the sound, and then felt a blinding pain up the back of my skull. I hit the ground hard, my head hurting so badly I couldn't even see. I was in pain, and all I could do was moan. The pain was immobilizing. I felt my body being dragged into the bushes, and I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was finally able to get one eye open, but that was all. I realized the other one was caked over in blood, probably from when I hit the ground. The pain was receding finally, and I struggled against the hold the person pulling me into the bushes had on my legs. I kicked out with all my might, and I heard the person struggle to keep his hands on my legs. He was breathing heavily, and apparently he was angry as he abandoned my legs, and I saw him lean over me and raise a fist, aiming towards my gut. I screamed then, and I heard footsteps heading in our direction. I continued fighting, kicking and punching at him as I screamed. I never saw his face, but then I heard a sickening thud and realized it was my head hitting the concrete. Searing pain coursed through my head, almost knocking me unconscious. Something large and black loomed over me, and first I heard a scream, and then I heard what sounded like a roar, and I assumed it was my own ears ringing, as the next thing I knew everything faded into blackness. "Dr. Gabardi?" I heard my name being called from a distance. "Dr. Gabardi, can you hear me? Hello?" I blinked once and opened my eyes. I realized that the voice was actually pretty close, as in right next to me. I tried to look around, but my neck hurt. It hurt badly, and I realized I must have heard it when I fell. "Oh, thank God you're awake," I heard another voice, and I turned towards it. It was my mother, and I blinked a few times, wondering what happened. Why was she here? Where was I? "Mom?" I peered up at her face in confusion, and then focused on my surroundings. From the smell of antiseptic chemicals, the beeps of various machines, and the fluorescent lighting, I knew I was in the hospital. What am I doing here? I attempted to sit up again, but she stopped me. "Take it easy, honey. You only just got here." I did as I was told. "How did I get here? How did you know I was here?" "Paul Jenson saw you being attacked by some wild animal and brought you to the emergency room. He's still here, by the way. Your knight in shining armor." I was too shocked to respond. Paul had saved me? And what wild animal was Paul talking about? I had been attacked by a person. I remembered that perfectly. My mom leaned in towards me, and her eyes, a vivid shade of green that matched my own, twinkled mischievously. "And oh gosh, he's a cutie. He told me that he's your student. Lucky you. If I had him in my class, I would be reported to the dean for coming on to him." I couldn't help but smile. My mom was a troublemaker, and like me, she had a doctorate degree in sociology and worked as a faculty member at a rival university. She also happened to be married to my father for the last 32 years, so I was pretty sure she wasn't planning on hitting on any students. She just liked to say outrageous things to get a response from me. I was sure of it now. I giggled like a little girl, not feeling like the 30-year-old I was, and said, "Oh, Mom. Stop. Or I'll tell Daddy." "Tell me what?" my dad said, entering the room. At 52, he was still a handsome man, and I was pretty sure that it was because of all the years he spent working as a carpenter. He came from old money, and had the luxury of doing whatever he wanted. His passion had been using his hands, so he became a carpenter and barely touched his trust fund. He was now retired, at least that's what he called sitting on the porch and watching his garden grow. "Nothing, Daddy, just Mom misbehaving like usual," I reassured my father, and Mom winked at me. "Where's Paul? Is he still here?" I asked Mom. She shrugged. "I think so. You want me to go out and get him?" "No," I said, not wanting him to see me in a hospital gown, and I was sure parts of me were bruised and swollen. My parents gave me a funny look, not expecting such a forceful refusal. I tried to cover up, saying, "I just think it would be awkward, since he's my student and all." My dad nodded and Mom shrugged. "Oh well. The doctor said you're fine, but who knows where that animal came from that attacked you. I mean, we're not that close to the woods. Such a scary occurrence. I wonder what it was." "Probably a bear," my dad said with a decisive nod. The more they discussed it, the more I thought that maybe they were right, and maybe because of the stress of the encounter, my memory was blocking out the details of the trauma of it. Surely it hadn't been a person who attacked me, it had to have been an animal. "Am I free to leave?" I asked. "Yep, you sure are. Do you want me to go get a nurse?" "Yeah, that would be great." Mom and Dad walked out of the room, still trying to decide who was right about what animal had tried to attack me. I leaned my head back against the pillow and closed my eyes. I thought I had only had them closed for a second, but when I opened them again, dark brown eyes stared down at me. I immediately tried to sit up, and Paul reached out his hand and stopped me. "I'm glad you're okay," he said without preamble, worry still etched across his face. His voice seemed to caress my ears even in my drugged state. I wondered if I was given some sort of tranquilizer. It sure felt like it. I said, my voice already slurring, "Thank you for helping me. Who knows what would have happened if you hadn't. Did you see the animal that attacked me?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. It was dark. I'm pretty sure an animal was involved, one way or another." His words were odd to me, but I was getting tired and my mind felt lazy. I didn't want to question him anymore. I guess he could see the exhaustion on my face as he reached out and stroked my straight red hair away from my forehead. His hand felt good against my face and I wanted it to stay there, but suddenly I felt very tired, so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. "Go to sleep, Sydney. I'll see you when you wake up." I reached up to touch his hand, and as I did, heat seemed to emanate between us, and I held his eyes until I couldn't keep mine open any longer, slowly releasing his hand as sleep overtook me yet again. Chapter 2. "Hello, everyone," I said, waving to my students as we stepped out of our cars and walked to our trunks to retrieve our luggage. It had been 2 weeks since my encounter with Paul and the animal that had attacked me. It was still a mystery what type of animal it had been, given that I didn't have a scratch or bite on me. However, I didn't dwell on it. When I had woken up again in the hospital, Paul hadn't been there as he promised, and I didn't see him the next week for class, nor the week after that. I had been concerned, but had other things to worry about, like the conference where we were presently. We had been invited to the conference months earlier, and several of my students were presenting their findings, including Paul. It was a 3-day overnight stay in a swanky hotel in the mountains, and those of my students who could get away signed up to attend. I figured Paul wouldn't miss his chance to present findings from his research relating to mythology from across the world, and so I expected him to arrive eventually. There were only 8 students in my class, and they all had my phone number. I was disappointed that I hadn't heard from Paul. I enjoyed the camaraderie with my students outside the classroom. I felt it improved my relationship with my students, which was important to me. I talked excitedly with them about what the conference had in store for us. And while I did so, I kept glancing around them, looking towards the exit, assuming that Paul would eventually show up. I didn't have to wait for long as I heard the only other guy in my class, Corey, yell out, "Paul. What's up, man? We thought you weren't going to make it." I looked in the direction Corey had turned and smiled at Paul in relief. I couldn't help myself. He smiled back at me, and then the other students gravitated toward him. Paul was so charismatic. He chatted easily with all of them before approaching me. "Dr. Gabardi, can I talk to you for a second in private?" "Sure," I said, feeling suddenly apprehensive. I didn't know what he wanted to discuss, but I assumed it was about missing class. "Is everything okay, Paul?" I said, trying to keep my voice even as the rest of the class moved towards the center check-in area and received their room keys. The conference was in what was known as Hill Country. The all-inclusive hotel in the country featured lots of outdoor activities and beautiful hillside views. I figured that's why all my students had wanted to attend. I let my eyes wander across the landscape while Paul led me away from within earshot of anyone. There was a little conference room to our right that was unoccupied, and we ducked into it. "Is everything okay?" I asked immediately, being sure that there was sufficient space in between us. That was difficult given that he seemed to shift forward any time I moved away, almost as if we were dancing. "Stop fidgeting, Sydney. He'll think you have some sort of nervous tic or something." I stuck my hands in my pockets and rocked back on my heels. I tucked my hair back behind my ears and trained my eyes on him. "I had some business to take care of out of town, that's why I didn't come to class. I apologize for not contacting you about it, but it came up suddenly and I had to deal with it quickly." I nodded and wanted to ask if everything were okay, but I didn't want to pry. I had a habit of becoming quite awkward when it came to subjects that I felt were personal. I also wanted to avoid looking into those dark brown eyes. "Well, it's good to have you back," I said, turning away and stepping towards the conference room doors. His next question stopped me. "How are you feeling? After the other night? You hit your head pretty hard. I don't see any signs of stitches, so I guess you're better now?" He stepped closer to me, so close that his body was only a few inches away from my own. I attempted to back up, and realized that I was up against a wall and could move no further. "Do I make you nervous, Dr. Gabardi?" he said, a small smile forming on his face. "What? No. I just air." I didn't know what to say, and it didn't matter. He wasn't going to give me the opportunity to say anything that wasn't in his plans. What was in his plans apparently was
censored
me as he easily closed the distance between us and lowered his lips to mine. The
censored
was so gentle, so slow and sweet that I couldn't help but
censored
his back. The way his lips moved over mine as if he were mesmerized by the feel of me made my entire body shake, and then when he traced a warm hand up my side and abandoned my mouth to trail his lips down my neck and up to my ears, I could barely breathe. He exhaled against my ear. "I've been wanting to do this since the first time I saw you." My only reply was a little moan as his hand began to work itself under my shirt, and he easily found my
censored
and pushed my bra to the side. He started roughly playing with my
censored
and I gasped. "Paul." "Shish," he said, aligning his body against mine so that I could feel his erection clearly pushing against my stomach. I wanted him. And at that thought, my eyes flew open and I pushed him away from me. To my surprise, he didn't let me go. Instead, he took me by my hands and pulled me into the conference room supply closet. "Paul, are you crazy? I'm your teacher. What if someone sees us? This is highly inappropriate."
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
"Oh my gosh, Paul. Isn't this the conference room for the welcome ceremony?" I whispered in horror. He wasn't listening. He was too busy staring at my
censored
I crossed my arms over my,
censored.
and he groaned in disappointment. Paul? I hissed. Help me find my shirt, please. People are coming. I know I sounded panicked, and that was because, frankly, I was panicking. I was in a supply closet with my student, semi-nude. I could see it already plastered across the school paper. Tenured faculty member caught topless with student 7 years her junior. I would be seen as the predatory older woman. My cheeks flushed at the thought. I was getting myself worked up. Paul didn't seem the least bit concerned, as he extracted my shirt from on top of a box of tissues. I hastily slipped it back on, and then looked down at his pants. Your pants are still undone, I said, and without thinking I reached forward and started fixing them. He groaned and didn't try to help at all. I realized that the groan was in pleasure, and sent him an annoyed look once I saw the smug smile on his face. What? He asked teasingly, and I gave him a mean look and zipped up his pants quickly. Hey. Watch it. You almost made me a eunuch. He whispered in an accusing voice. I ignored him and tiptoed towards the door. I opened it just a little and peeked out. My heart could have plummeted to the floor. It was too late. People were already coming in and filling up the chairs. I groaned inwardly and outwardly blamed Paul. There are people out there. See what you did? We're going to get caught. When I looked over my shoulder at him, he didn't look the least bit concerned. Instead, he was rubbing his palms across my backside, clearly enjoying himself. Paul? I said, and decided to just shut up. I was starting to feel like an admonishing kindergarten teacher, instead of the college professor that I was. I decided then and there to just be quiet and hope we weren't found out. Apparently Paul had other plans. It was easily the longest 30 minutes of my life. I could hear the guest speaker and the polite laughter of the crowd. I knew the guest speaker. He was the department chair at a prominent college in the area. He was also extremely uptight and no nonsense. I cringed at the thought of him finding us. I just couldn't believe I'd gotten into this situation. Here I was in a supply closet, hitting at the hands of my student, who now had his hands again under my top. Stop it. I hissed at him for what felt like the 100th time. He whispered, I think we should take advantage of the moment. No. I don't think so. I whispered back, trying to sound stern. He took that moment to press his lips again against my neck and pull me back towards him. I couldn't help my instant reaction as I ground my hips against his still hard member, my back leaning against his.
Censored.
I can't believe this is happening, I breathed out as he massaged my.
Censored.
Through my shirt. Do you really want me to stop? Paul said, and I wanted to say no. Instead, I said nothing at all. I guess Paul took silence as consent, as he let his hand slip between my legs. Suddenly I found my voice again. Actually, yes. You probably should stop. I was wet. Very wet, and for some reason I was embarrassed that he turned me on so much. The whole situation was embarrassing me, in fact. As if sensing that, Paul abruptly dropped his hand and said, disappointment clearly in his voice, You're probably right. Some other time, I guess. He brought his cell phone out of his pocket and said, Well, according to the agenda, this will go on for at least another 30 minutes. What do you suggest we do until then? The glow of the light from his cell phone illuminated his face before he closed it, and I was reminded of how beautiful his eyes were, and I finally noticed that his lips were full, lips that had been on my body only minutes ago. Stay focused, I reminded myself. I said to Paul, we shouldn't do anything. Let's just sit here and do nothing. Deal? I instantly stuck my hand out in the darkness, but I couldn't see very well. Paul groaned, and I realized that I had completely missed his hand and had instead run into his crotch. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He chuckled, Don't apologize. I liked it. I sighed to myself, this was going to be a very long 30 minutes. Chapter 3. It was the next day, and I still couldn't look Paul in the eye without blushing. We had managed to get out of the supply closet without anyone seeing us, and we had each gone our separate ways so that no one would suspect anything, but I still felt self-conscious. I'm sure my students had noticed that I wasn't there. And I'm sure they noticed that Paul hadn't attended the opening ceremony either. The only saving grace I could think of was that at least they didn't know where we had been instead. I'm sure they just assumed we had been talking privately regarding Paul's presentation or something. At least that's what I hoped they thought. When I saw them the next day, they didn't let on that they had seen something or suspected anything, and I had given a sigh of relief. And much to my relief as well, Paul kept his distance and didn't say much when we were around the others. I went out of my way to be sure I wasn't alone with him, but it wasn't that hard. He seemed preoccupied with his presentation that was on later that day. I had a panel discussion that I was going to help moderate in the afternoon, and I expected at least one of my students to attend. My session was pretty full, and I sat at a table in the front that was off to the side, as there was already a moderator present, but I wanted to be there just in case I was needed. I was surprised to see Paul in the audience. I didn't think he was into quantitative research, which is what the presentation focused on. He was seated towards the back of the auditorium where the session was being held, so I figured it wouldn't be too hard to ignore him. I sat my cell phone on the table and was engrossed in the discussion when my cell phone beeped. I looked down at it, wondering who would be calling me now. Besides my parents and my best friend, I didn't get many calls. I didn't recognize the number, but checked the message, annoyed that my attention was off the discussion at hand. I was a statistics nerd and loved talking about it, so the interruption of my cell phone was definitely unwelcome. Annoyed, I checked the message and almost dropped my phone. I thought about our closet session all night, was what the text message said. I looked up immediately in Paul's direction, and he shot me a knowing look and a small smile. I felt myself blush and hastily exited the screen, putting my phone on vibrate. My phone vibrated in my hand. Did you think about me? Read the next message. I looked again in his direction, but he seemed to be now listening to the speaker. I took that moment to text back. No. I watched him as he looked down at his phone, read the message and looked back up at me with another small teasing smile. He was enjoying himself. Are you wearing any panties? Was his next text, and with chagrin, I realized that this text aroused me. My body instantly reacted. And before I could text back, another text came through. I can see you're
censored.
You're aroused? I looked down and realized that because my
censored
were large, the top did little to hide my clear sign of arousal, and I wished at that moment that the ground would open up and swallow me. I tried to be subtle and crossed my arms over my
censored,
willing my boobs to get the message that they weren't allowed to show my excitement at Paul's words. I kept my cell phone in my hand and looked around to see if anyone else noticed that I was texting. I hoped they didn't, but I couldn't be too sure. Move your arms. You're ruining the view. Came the next text. I ignored it. I'm hurt. You're ignoring me. I looked in his direction, and he again was pretending to pay attention to the speaker. Apparently, I was the only one in the room who knew that he was doing the absolute opposite. Stop texting me. I mouthed to him across the room when he finally made eye contact with me. He looked at me innocently and shrugged his shoulders as if he didn't know what I was talking about. I turned away, determined to ignore him. I subtly looked over the crowd and then at the panel, hoping no one noticed that I was half arguing and half ignoring text messages from my student. You're so sexy when you're angry, said the next message, and I rolled my eyes and shook my head. Dr. Gabardi, you seem to disagree. You're the expert. Perhaps you have a different view of things? Said one of the presenters. All eyes turned in my direction. I was caught off guard, but thankful that I had kept up with most of the conversation, so I smoothly answered, and everyone nodded in agreement, clearly impressed with what I had to say. I felt self-satisfied when I was done, and would have pat myself on the back if I could. Apparently, I had no problem thinking on my feet or sounding intelligent when I needed to. If only I could apply that same confidence to dealing with Paul, I thought to myself. Speaking of Paul, He waited a few minutes after I was done speaking and texted, "I think your intelligence might be your sexiest feature." I smiled then, I couldn't help it. It was such a flattering comment, and it was scores ahead of comments about my
censored.
My phone didn't vibrate again during the presentation, and as the moderator wrapped up, I glanced in Paul's direction, but he wasn't there. I hadn't noticed him leaving, and wondered when he had disappeared. I knew his presentation was next, and I wanted to give him a taste of his own medicine. With a little smile on my face, I arrived at his discussion and took a seat towards the back. He smiled at me when he saw me, and nodded in my direction in acknowledgement. I smiled back, and as he was about to get started, I sent one text message. "I'm wearing panties. And they're wet?" He visibly gulped, and I felt a moment of power as I crossed my legs, sat back and smiled. This was going to be a great presentation. 40 minutes later, Paul wrapped up his session. I clapped with the others. It had been really interesting, and I had enjoyed it. Paul was one of the better presenters that I'd had the pleasure of hearing, and that wasn't me being partial. The rest of the crowd hadn't said a word as he spoke. He commanded the audience's attention with his presence, and held it with his words. I was sure that I was the only one who actually had a physical reaction to his voice, but there was an almost hypnotic quality to it that made you lean in and want to listen. I left while he answered questions, but the entire time I could feel his eyes on my back following my every move. I headed to the next session, hoping to catch up with some of my other students when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I was already smiling as I reached for it. "How about dinner tonight?" I had a skip in my step as I replied. "You're on." He texted back a smiley face, and I couldn't help but actually laugh out loud. Later that evening he called me, and we made plans to meet up at a restaurant in a small town about 25 miles from where the conference was being held. Although our relationship wasn't exactly prohibited, given that my university didn't have a policy that prohibited students and professors from dating, I still wanted to be careful. Our relationship, or budding relationship as it might be, would still be frowned upon even if it wasn't specifically prohibited by university code. I had to admit, I was excited as I drove towards the restaurant where we were scheduled to meet. Besides the fact that I was ridiculously attracted to Paul physically, he also intellectually stimulated me. I didn't have anything really nice to wear on our date, so I was glad when he mentioned a place that was pretty casual. I donned on my best pair of jeans and a pretty top. It was a light pink lace blouse, and it made me look sexy, but still tasteful. I then put on a pair of heels. In terms of makeup, I went for a very natural look with just a little mascara and lip gloss. I didn't want him to think that I was trying too hard. Whatever that actually meant, I thought with a smile to myself. I pulled up and parked my car. I saw him leaning against his car, casually waiting for me in the parking lot. I thought again how sexy he was. Looking at him, I was glad I went with jeans and a blouse. He wore just a plain blue button-down shirt, and a pair of jeans as well. He didn't smile when I pulled up and got out of the car. Instead, he just stared at me intently, as if trying to memorize everything about me. I didn't speak either, letting my eyes roam over his body freely. "Are you done undressing me with your eyes?" I asked him. "Almost," he said, raising one brow and looking really focused. I laughed and he smiled then and took my hand. He
censored
the back of it as he escorted me through the entrance. I felt a tingle of heat go up my spine, and my heartbeat raced as his lips pressed against my flesh. When we were settled at a table, I took a moment to look around at the restaurant he had chosen. It was definitely rustic and resembled a log cabin. I saw massive ovens in the rear of the room, and my mouth watered at the scent of meat cooking that permeated the air. He looked around to where I was staring, and then looked back at me. "Tell me you're not a vegetarian." "Actually, well." "Oh no, I'm sorry. I should have asked first," he said, clearly frustrated with himself, and I decided to let him off the hook easy. I shook my head. "You're so gullible. I'm not a vegetarian. I'm a huge carnivore. Honestly, I can't even remember the last time I had a salad. Give me a hamburger instead of arugula any day. He shuddered. Arugula. I can't stand the stuff. It's right up there with bean sprouts and tofu in my opinion. I mockingly put a hand on my
censored
and said, a man after my own heart. We must be soulmates. I think so. He said those words softly, and from the intense look of his eyes, I wondered if maybe he actually meant it. I quickly changed the subject, hoping to stick to lighter topics. I realized I didn't know much about him, so I started there. Where are you from? I asked as our waiter came back with our drink orders. I grew up in Canada actually, near Vancouver. Really? I would have never guessed. Did you move here just for school? No. I've lived in the US for a while. I've traveled a little bit all over. Which places did you like the most? The warm ones, he said, and I had to smile, even though I felt as if he were being deliberately vague. We grew quiet as we looked over our menus. I wasn't disappointed at all. There were so many options to choose from, and everything sounded appetizing. When we finally ordered, we relaxed a little more, and I told him about my parents and growing up in Texas. I found it interesting that he liked Texas so much, especially given where he was from. So life here suits you is what I'm hearing? He nodded. I do really enjoy living here. I plan to go for a PhD though, so I don't know where I'll eventually end up. I tried to keep the smile I had earlier plastered in place. He planned to leave. I couldn't get upset with him about that. He wanted to further his education. At least he was upfront about that, so now I knew not to get emotionally invested. I just worried that it was too late. Because I feared against my better judgment, I already had. Chapter 4. Dinner with Paul ended earlier than I had wanted it to. That was unfortunate, as I was really enjoying getting to know him. He was smart, funny, easygoing, and that voice of his still did sexy things to me whenever I heard it. It was dark as we were driving back, and I didn't know the area well, so I tried to be as cautious as possible. My thoughts were on Paul the whole time. Things between us had escalated really quickly, but if I thought about it, the
censored
tension between us had been there for a while. I just refused to acknowledge it. I thought I was just turned on by his voice, but no, it had been more than that. I had wanted him since the first day he walked into my classroom, so confidently. I felt our entire time knowing each other, each classroom session had been some form of foreplay. And now after dinner, I realized he felt the same way too. I felt an
censored
between my thighs for him and told myself to calm down. He was set to graduate at the end of the month, and I thought then would be the perfect time to explore things between us. He had agreed, and we promised to keep our hands away from each other, at least while we were on campus. I groaned to myself. It was going to be a long 4 weeks until he graduated. I was so busy bemoaning the lack of
censored
that I would have to endure until Paul graduated that I didn't see the creature in the road at first, but then my eyes adjusted to the darkness and I swerved to avoid hitting it. I screamed as my car veered towards a cliff, and I stomped on the brakes as hard as I could. My tires squealed as they came to a stop, and just as I thought I was going to be fine, the car started tipping dangerously to the side. I sat there for a second, scared to make a move, knowing that one wrong move would mean me careening off the cliff in my car. Suddenly I saw a shadow at my window and I jumped, startled. It was just Paul. Unfortunately, as soon as I realized that, I also realized that my abrupt movement had been enough to push the car off its precarious slant, and with a scream I felt the car leaning over, about to fall off the cliff. I closed my eyes as the car tumbled once and then twice, throwing my body side to side, and then all was still as it rested against a large tree. I realized that my door was now open, as I had crashed into it while falling. I was sore and scared. I knew I was only minutes from dropping down the entire 200 feet to the bottom, but there was nothing I could do about it. A sob broke out of my lips, and then before I could move, I felt the car shifting again, about to plunge to the ground, and then I saw Paul, easily holding on to a boulder next to me, yelling for me to take his hand. "Come on, Sydney, quick!" he shouted through the window at me. My mind scrambled to come up with a way to get to him without jeopardizing my own safety, but I couldn't think of what to do. If I reached for his hand, surely my body weight would make the car fall, but if I didn't reach for his hand, I would probably be crushed to death in the car. "I can't. It'll fall. I can't," I yelled back, feeling hysteria bubble up at the idea of my own impending death. "Trust me, Sydney, just make a jump for it. I'll catch you. I promise." I didn't know how he planned to do that. In no way could I picture that working. He must have saw the fear and doubt in my eyes, because he began to plead with me. "Please, Sydney. Give me your hand or you'll die." I looked down at the ground and then up at Paul. I didn't want to die. As the car again began to slide through the trees, I jumped for Paul's outstretched hand, screaming the whole time, and the car lurched towards the ground, hitting stone and trees before it toppled towards the ground. And my body went with it. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. And then, terrified, I figured it out. I missed Paul's hand, and I was being pulled down with the car since my foot was now entangled in the seatbelt. Paul couldn't catch me. There was no way he could, and I screamed all the way down, struggling against the seatbelt, hanging onto the door for dear life. Rocks and trees cut into my skin as I plummeted down with the car. I was about to close my eyes, not wanting to see my own imminent death, when Paul came back into my line of vision. I watched in utter shock as he dashed down the mountain towards me, defying gravity, running full speed towards me. He jumped over boulders, pushed through the trees, looking as if the exercise in saving me was completely effortless. I couldn't take my eyes off of him as I struggled out of the seatbelt, and as I felt the car leaving my body behind, and I began to fall towards the ground on my own. As I continued to scream, Paul jumped for me and I extended my hands, and this time he securely wrapped my hand in his, and pulled me to him as if I weighed nothing at all. The car hit the ground. I heard it, but I didn't see it since my head was buried in Paul's.
Censored.
My arms clung around his neck and I breathed heavily, trying to catch my breath. My entire body was shaking, and I realized that the entire time Paul was talking softly to me. "You're okay, Sydney. I got you. You're going to be fine. You're okay." I couldn't stop shaking, and I also started to cry. I stuttered as I said, "WWW, what are we going to do now?" He said simply, "Hang on." And then with one arm he started to navigate the mountain, scaling it easily, not even winded as he climbed at least 50 feet with me cradled in one of his arms. He then hoisted me up and over the edge, as if I weighed about as much as a leaf. I wasn't exactly a small woman, and yet, he had no problem throwing me over the edge to safety. I landed with a thump and dragged myself backwards, still breathing heavily. Paul hefted himself up easily and landed gracefully next to me. I breathed in deeply, and just as I was about to ask how he had been able to do so many of those feats that I had seen, I heard a growl from behind me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around slowly, and behind me was apparently the creature that had started this whole ordeal. It was a mountain lion, and apparently it was hungry. It leapt toward Paul, and he went down at the force of its body barreling into his. I screamed and scrambled backwards, and I watched as Paul threw it off easily. It didn't even register being thrown, as it leapt instead towards me. I tried to get up and run, but I needn't have even tried as it sprung on me and knocked me down. I screamed as its claws sank into my back. I then heard a roar, and the giant cat disappeared from my back, taking a layer of my shirt off with it. I flipped over, gasping for breath, and the sight before me made me almost faint. Standing behind me with the mountain lion in its hands was a giant black bear. I looked frantically for Paul. I didn't see him anywhere. I didn't know what to do. I jumped up and started to run, calling out for Paul as I did. I heard a whimper, and then a howl. I didn't bother to look behind me. I knew it was the mountain lion, and I also knew that I didn't have a chance fighting either one of them. I ran as fast as I could, and then I heard the heavy footsteps behind me. I turned around, the bear was heading my way. I started screaming, and then the mountain lion appeared again. I instantly came to a stop, and the bear came towards me. I was sobbing in fear as they both approached me slowly, and then the mountain lion retreated. I backed up slowly. The bear stood at least 7 feet tall, and he looked at me. He was ferocious. His mouth was huge and intimidating. I didn't know what to do, and then the bear's head snapped back, and he let out a roar as his body began to recede into itself. His fur began to shift, and in its place was strong human muscles, and as the snout began to disappear, a human face began to form. And as I watched, the bear completely disappeared, and in the moonlight was now Paul. He reached for me, and I screamed. He reached again, and I kicked out as hard as I could. He was
censored
and vulnerable, hence he couldn't block one of my kicks, and my heel connected with his crotch. He stumbled back, grabbing himself as he went down on his knees. He groaned my name, and I stood up and kicked him in the face this time and ran towards his car. I slammed myself in it, and thanked God that the keys were still in the ignition. I started the car, pushed down on the gas, and drove the car straight down the road where Paul had been previously. There was no sign of him. I realized that I was shaky, and tried to get my head together. I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea, but all I knew is that I had to get out of there. I drove towards the resort, still shaking, wondering how I would explain what had happened to anyone, knowing that no one would believe me. I felt blood running down my cheek, and realized that I had cut my face. It was too bad. I actually liked my face the way it was. With that thought, I knew then that I was getting hysterical. As I got closer to the resort, I sobbed in gratitude. I parked the car, stumbled out of it, and went running toward the entrance. I didn't make it as a hand grabbed me and yanked me off my feet. It was Paul, and he dragged me kicking and screaming back to his car. "Calm down, Sydney. Calm down. I can explain everything," he said, his voice exasperated. But there was no way I planned to calm down. I had seen him shapeshift from a bear to a man. There was no way I was going to calm down now. I hit out at him with my fists and kicked him as hard as I could, attempting to bite his hand at one point. He yelped when my teeth came down on his flesh, and then he mumbled, "I'm sorry, but you have to go in here until you calm down." He banged the trunk open, shoved me in, and I screamed the whole time, even when he closed the lid, encapsulating me in darkness. I soon felt the car moving, and I continued to kick and scream. I kept it up for at least 10 minutes until I went hoarse. And then, feeling helpless, I cried silently to myself. What did he plan to do with me? As the car slowed down, my whole body tensed up, and then the car stopped. I could hear footsteps approaching, and Paul opened the trunk. I stared up at him and said, "Please don't kill me." He looked at me as if I were crazy. "Kill you? I saved your life twice tonight and 3 times since we met, and you still think I plan to kill you?" I couldn't say a word and then managed to make myself speak. "What are you?" He sighed. "If you promise not to kick, bite, and scratch, I'll get you out of this trunk and tell you." He held his hand out to me, and I was torn. Could I trust this man-beast? Chapter 5. "What are you?" I said again, sitting on the edge of the trunk while Paul stood in front of me. His body was tense, as if he were afraid that I would try to escape. He looked at me. "I'm human just like you." "You know you're not human." He nodded. "I am. I just have certain abilities." "Like running down mountains and turning into a bear?" He nodded. "Yep. Yep." He shrugged. "I can't explain what I am. Why do you think I'm so interested in mythical creatures? It's not just an interest. It's my obsession. I don't know how I became this. I was adopted, and have no idea who my biological parents are. I've traveled everywhere trying to find out more about me, but as far as I know, I'm the only one." He sounded frustrated and pained about his predicament, if one could call it that. I immediately felt less fear and more sympathy. "Are you some sort of werewolf?" He shrugged and laughed harshly, brushing a hand through his hair. I then noticed that his hand was cut open, and dried blood caked the wound. A souvenir from the mountain lion, I thought wryly to myself. I immediately reached for his hand, forgetting that only minutes ago I had been pleading for him not to kill me. As he said, he had rescued me multiple times. If he meant me any harm, then he could have let me die. Speaking of which, that was you that night on the campus? You saved me? I wasn't attacked by an animal. That was a man who grabbed me. He nodded. When he saw me change to bear form, I scared him so bad, he started to have a heart attack. Excuse me? He sighed. He literally grabbed his heart and hit the ground right then and there. I tossed him into the dumpster. The problem was, I had already turned into a bear. People saw me, as a bear that is, so I had to come up with a good enough story. I left you behind the bushes. You had fainted anyway, and I just slipped my clothes back on when I transformed back into a human. It took only a minute, and then I drove you to the hospital and called your parents. Their number was in your cell phone. I couldn't get past the other statement he made. So you left the other guy in the dumpster? Was he still alive? He shrugged. I didn't particularly care to check. I could only imagine what he planned to do to you, and I made sure he didn't do it. I nodded. He had a point. I couldn't even let my mind think about what that man might have done to me if Paul hadn't saved me when he did. So what's next? I asked him. He looked towards the full moon and said, I don't know. I still plan to try to find out more about my kind. Travel the world. Do more research. Someone must know something. And you plan to do this alone? Yeah. Absolutely. He then paused and said, not that I would turn away any company. He approached me and I said, Paul? Yeah, he was now leaning down to
Censored.
Me. You're
Censored.
He laughed, and you would be right. His mouth covered mine, and I didn't think about anything else as he wrapped his arms around me and picked me up, leading me to the backseat of the car.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
I slowly did the same. I settled at one side of the car, and he settled at the other. I looked out through the windows and realized for the first time that he had parked directly near the entrance of a cave. Don't tell me you live there, was all I was capable of saying as I tried to get my thoughts together and steady my breathing. He glanced around confused and then saw the cave, and he erupted in laughter. What? I was a little offended. I live in a house. You know, like a normal person. I just pulled over when I thought you passed out in the trunk. Yeah, about that. No more putting me in trunks. He raised his hand as if to ward me off. I didn't want to put you in the trunk, but you were hysterical and wouldn't listen to me. Let's see why. I had just witnessed my boyfriend turn into a bear after we were both attacked by a mountain lion. A mountain lion that I swerved to avoid, which unfortunately left me falling down a cliff. I think I had a right to be a little hysterical tonight. He smiled. So I'm your boyfriend? I gave him an annoyed look. Is that all you got out of that lecture? Yep. I motioned to get out of the car, and he stopped me and pulled me into his arms. Now that we weren't making love, I could feel the chill in the air and I shook. He settled me closer to him. He brought his chin to rest on the top of my head. I would like to be your boyfriend if you'll have me. Maybe you could go on sabbatical, and you could help me search for others like me. Help me solve the mystery of being me. The way he said it so simply with so much sincerity tugged at my heart, and I rubbed my palm across his cheek. I would really like that. I would love to help you. He
Censored.
Me gently on the mouth, and I felt my eyes growing heavy as I leaned against him. Not only did his arms feel safe and warm, but in my heart, being in Paul's presence felt like home. Thank you for reading my book. If you like this story, I think you'll enjoy my book. Get your copy of Sold to the Werewolf now. Please leave a review if you like this book. That's the best thing you can do to help authors like me, so others can find my books. It can be as long or as short as you'd like. Even a star rating is amazing and appreciated. Thanks in advance. About Summer Cooper. Thank you so much for reading. Without you, it wouldn't be possible for me to be a full-time author. I hope you enjoy reading my books as much as I do writing them. Besides, obviously, reading and writing, I also love cuddling my dogs, shouting at Alexa, being upside down, aka yoga, and driving my family cray-cray. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Goodreads, BookBub. Get in touch at hello@summercooper.com. www.summercooper.com. Closing credits. This has been Bear Attack. Written by Summer Cooper. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited. Production copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited.